All right. Well, good morning, Chris LaCroix. Good morning to everybody on. I'm thrilled to have Chris be a part of this, which is evolving into what I would say the Aspen Real Estate Experience, an opportunity to learn about different facets of the real estate industry in Aspen and the Roaring Fork Valley. I thought about this concept from the lens of my two teenage boys and remembering that I had no clue what I wanted to do coming out of high school or even college, and what would I have loved to know about real estate back then, or even a glimpse of what I know now to know back then. So, Chris is a an amazing local real estate attorney who I've worked with a ton over the past years. And I know, Chris, you have some of your partners on the call, so welcome, and please feel free to intro your partners.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it. It's great to be available to all you guys out there. And thanks again, Andrew, for thinking of me and us. I've asked to participate on the call three of my partners. Kelsey Nichols is not available because she just had a crisis come up this morning, so she's got to attend to some more pressing matters, but she would like to be here. She's a partner in the firm, and she runs our Carbondale office and does a ton of real estate work and for all up and down the valley. So Kelsey is a great resource to anybody who needs a lawyer, but she's just not able to join us. But I do have with us Chad Schmidt, who's a partner of mine, also based in the Aspen office. Chad started his career at Garfield and Hector around the same time I did, but he spent the beginning of his legal career doing litigation, and has sort of morphed more onto the transactional business real estate side of things and has been focusing on that the past few years. And then also with me today is Haley Carmer, who's a partner in our Glenwood office, and she, like Kelsey, works all up and down the valley. And we've got the fact that we've got offices in Carbondale and Glenwood is more about finding homes for bodies, not so much where they practice. So any one of us, is happy to work on anything in any part of the valley, but where we go to work, when we go to work, sort of varies on where we have space and what's close to home, that sort of thing. So Haley and Chad are with us, and happy to answer and field any questions or anything you guys want to talk about.
Awesome. Well, appreciate you all being on. Haley and Chad, welcome, and Kelsey, sorry to miss, but I know the vibe with offices up and down the valley. We have, I think we're around 170 agents and offices between Aspen and Glenwood and 30-ish staff, and so sometimes it's where you live is where you work, and sometimes it's where you can find an office and put people in. So I get it. All right, so let's start out, Chris. If you hopped onto the gondola and met somebody new and they said to you, "What do you do?" How would you describe it?
Huh. Um, I tell people that I'm a lawyer in Aspen and that, you know, we have my firm is, we're the largest firm on the Western Slope, which is, doesn't mean we're big like Chicago, New York, and LA law firms, but we are a full service law firm for Western Colorado. And we primarily have two big picture departments. We've got a litigation department and a transactional practice. And the line I've been saying for 30 years now is, if you're a transactional lawyer in Aspen or the Valley and you don't do real estate, you probably don't have a full-time job. I mean, so we all do other things that are related to business, but because so much of the economy here in this valley is driven by the real estate world and the real estate market, it turns out that, the vast majority of what Chad and Haley and Kelsey and I do on a day-to-day basis is related to real estate somehow. And that's, buying and selling real estate with, sophisticated high-end clients at astronomical prices. And it's representing lenders that are making loans where real estate's the collateral, or working with developers who are looking for, land use approvals or entitlements or zoning things, or clients who want variances. And then a lot of that is, after the deal closes, the neighbors need to come up with an easement or a fence line dispute or a mutual agreement to do a fence, that sort of thing.
I
That
love that you touched on such a breadth of things because I would think a lot of people when they think of a real estate attorney, maybe coming from a different part of the country or the world, they think it's pretty pretty simple. Okay, somebody who's either writing a contract or reading a contract or just facilitating the to get to closing. There are so many aspects that I've seen you be involved in. You just touched on some of them. I'm thinking I'm this person in the gondola. You just explained this to me. One thing that pops into my mind is, well, do you like working with buyers better or sellers better?
Huh. Um, so this is a very lawyerly answer. The ideal client for me is a seller who I didn't represent when they bought it, because if the buyer's lawyer finds problems with the property, and when I say problems with the property, I'm talking not so much about home inspection and construction issues and defective boilers and roofs. I mean, that's never the lawyer's thing. But when you're dealing with title and survey review, and is there an easement for this, or should there be an easement for that, or is something encroaching on the property, if I represent a buyer, we all try to do our best and make sure we dot all the i's and cross the t's. But if something falls through the cracks, which can happen, and then 3, 4, 5 years later, that buyer becomes a seller, and Chad's on the other side of the deal and we're not at the same firm, and he says, Chris, what about this? And if it's something that was there when I represented my seller when he was a buyer, I've got to explain sort of how I missed that. So as a lawyer, it's sort of less stressful to be, I've got a call from a new client who I didn't represent when they bought it. They need help selling the property. Part of what I enjoy the most about what I do is there's creative problem solving kind of thing where you don't know what's coming at you, but here's a curveball and let's put our heads together. Andrew and I have done tons of this together over the years. And if the buyer is finding things that are potentially problematic, oftentimes the seller was not aware of it until the buyer brought it to their attention. Then you're just sort of working with the seller to, how do we respond to this? Do we just pretend like we don't care? We've lived with it. Let's tell the buyer we're not going to do anything, and we assume the next buyer won't care and hope that the current buyer moves on, or do we offer to make a concession? Do we try to deal with it? That sort of thing. But in terms of the issues, there's more work to do on the buyer side.
Mhm.
The seller's lawyer in a transaction is almost always, looking at the contract first is the most important thing, because as everyone on this call knows, the buyer has a lot of outs once a contract's signed. The seller doesn't really have any unless the buyer asks for something, which opens the door for the seller to make a move. So once the contract's signed, the seller's lawyer sort of goes into, let's just wait and react to what, if anything, comes at us from the buyer's side. And when you're on the buyer's side, that's sometimes that involves a lot of work depending on the particular property.
It's so fascinating hearing your response, because what it makes me think about is risk management or risk mitigation. And for years, as a real estate agent, and for all of our agents, any in the business now, I think if you don't have this lens of how am I mitigating risk for my client, for myself, for the situation going forward, and that can take a lot of forms, right? So, like you said, if you're an agent or an attorney representing a seller before a contract is signed, are we buttoned up and are we feeling good here? I also like how you started the response about wanting to ideally represent a seller where they weren't your client as the buyer. And it just makes me think, okay, so when an agent goes to pitch for a listing and the client says, yeah, I want you to list my property. Chris was my attorney when we bought it. Let's call Chris. They should say, no, we want to get a different attorney because Chris was the one when we bought it. I'm just kidding.
No,
Um,
no. I mean, I often decline work if some, one in this valley, as everyone knows, conflicts of interest arise all the time, where there's a limited number of properties and a limited number of lawyers, and
sure.
so if I represent somebody in a transaction where I was the buyer's lawyer, and then the buyer then becomes an owner, and that owner becomes a seller, and then somebody contacts Chad or Haley and says, "Hey, can you represent me? I want to buy this property." Um, Technically, we could ask the seller, who was our client at the time years ago, for a waiver so that we could represent a new buyer. But I personally often decline that because I feel like
Mhm.
we shouldn't be looking at our own work. That the new buyer should have the benefit of a fresh set of eyes, because even if the seller's willing to waive the conflict, I don't like that the optics of, if we find something now that we didn't notice 5 years ago, that puts everybody in an awkward position.
Of course, yeah. No, and I remember working with you many times where the very first response is, let me run a conflict check and then we'll go from there. So I think that's a very standard operating procedure. Do you have a sense where your business comes from? Like what percent comes through real estate agents versus past clients or other referrals?
Um, I'll answer, and I'd like to hear from Chad and Haley on this one too. I mean, I think personally, uh, most of my personal work comes from, word of mouth people that I've worked with in the past.
Hmm.
The people, I worked with a Andrew Erneman gave somebody my name, or
Hmm.
I represented of somebody who was a buyer or a seller, and then a friend of theirs was going to be a buyer or seller, and my client recommended, call Chris. He
Hmm.
helped me a few years ago, and he was okay. So I
Sure.
would say probably 50-50 that way.
Hmm.
Chad, Haley, what do you guys feel like in your world?
I would agree, Chris. Yeah, decent amount through brokers directly. They have a client they're working with and they come to us, or they are referring a client that they are not necessarily working with on that transaction, but know they need an attorney, and then yeah, word of mouth through other clients for sure.
Yeah, this is Chad. I'm on the same page. I'd say about 70% comes through brokers and then 30% comes through just friends and contacts in the community.
Cool.
And I know the same thing happens in the your world on the real estate agent side of things, Andrew. But one of the most flattering types of new businesses when someone says to me, you were on the other side of a transaction
Mm.
and I liked the way you handled it. And are you available to represent me now in a totally new, different, unrelated matter? And
Yeah.
that's always nice when people say, I saw the way I always strive to, because sometimes these transactions are smooth. Everyone sings kumbaya from start to finish and everybody celebrates at the end, but that's not always the case. And I always feel like, when it gets stressful, when it gets tense, I try to, explain my client's position in a way that I hope the other side, the brokers and the principals on the other side, at least understand where we're coming from and why.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's even though it's very collegiate within the real estate profession in the Roaring Fork Valley because so many of us know each other, whether that's as agents or as attorneys or inspectors, appraisers, etc. There's nothing sweeter than when somebody comes over to you from your competition and says, I really like how you do your business and I want to work with you. I think that's very cool. Is there a particular type of property or neighborhood that you enjoy most or that you actually don't want to do?
Uh, Again, I want to hear from Haley and Chad on this. I mean, at this point in my career, I'm more interested in interesting properties that when I go visit them, I think they're cool. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm less, I'm always happy to do whatever's needed. But if somebody calls me, at 6 o'clock on a Friday night to say, I need to get this offer in by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and it's for a condo at the Gant, I personally feel like I've got other lawyers in my firm who can do that just as well as I can. And that's what I did, 25, 30 years ago. And it's time for somebody else to sort of do that. I mean, that work is important and we appreciate it. But, so
Right.
I like to, I don't pick and choose in the sense that I decline work, but I'm more excited when it's a cool property somewhere that has something unique about it.
Cool. Yeah. Chad or Haley, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, same. The more interesting, the more work we usually end up doing, and I feel like we can add more value to those types of transactions where there is a little more meat to it. I do a lot on the land use side as well, so those properties that have some unique, existing entitlements, or the buyer wants to do something different with it, or wants to know what's going on around the property to see what they're getting into. Those issues are always fun for me personally.
Cool.
Yeah, this is Chad. I enjoy working on the ranch properties. I think there's just so many different aspects to it between the water, the easements, and environmental issues that they're fun to work on.
How much do you find, Chad, on properties like that that are complex in terms of some of the different specialties that you might not see? Like in Chris's example, in a Gantt condo, you don't have to deal with water rights or easements, things like that. How much do you pull in, either within your firm or outside of it, other professionals that have to help with that process?
Yeah, we're lucky at our firm because we have, a few attorneys that specialize in water law. So we pull them in on those and have them look at all those aspects. And then, from the outside, a lot of times we'll bring in an environmental inspector and or a land use planner to assist us with analyzing the development potential of those projects.
Cool. That was the softball I gave you guys, was the water rights. I knew you have water rights in there, so you're welcome. Chris, what's the hardest part of your job?
Uh, Hardest part of my job is to be a counselor in addition to being an advocate, because telling as you guys all know on this call, there's a lot of successful people in this valley who got there through their smarts and creativity and hard work and dedication. And the technical advice is easy to give, and when it's time to uh, yeah, actually, the most rewarding part of my job is brainstorming with all these creative, successful problem solvers. But the hard part is when you have a completely different, you know, idea of how this should proceed, and you've got a client who is, who you trust, who trusts you, and they want to go one way, and you think that's an absolute disaster, and you have to figure out a way to sort of do the dance with them and figure out, well, if I want to go 180 degrees the opposite direction, we have to have a conversation. And it never gets to the point where you say I'm going to resign, but that's the hardest part of the job is when you're you're at odds with your own client, and you feel strongly that you've got a better idea than they do, and they feel exactly the opposite.
Isn't that interesting? And I'd never really thought about that parallel, but as a real estate agent for years, of course, and our agents, certainly the ones on this call, know that I have this mantra that I pound in to their brains, which is know the business, know the market, create value. If you can do those three things, you can be successful. Of course, you have to also be able to generate business in any profession, and certainly in sales. But what gets lost in there is what you touched on first, I guess, is the create value. That's the fun part. That's where if you can do that well, and I feel like that comes with experience, that just comes with number of transactions and different clients and scenarios. If you can really create value, then you walk away feeling like you've added something to a person, to a transaction, to a situation that's really great. But what I hadn't accounted for, and you touched on, is uh, I majored in psychology in college. I didn't plan on going into any field related to psychology. I just thought it was interesting. But how much that has come back over
Now
the
you have a
years.
PhD.
Yeah, over the years, it's like it didn't matter if I studied in college or not. You are thrown into the mix. It's such a people-driven business, and therefore personality, situational. And I remember like early on, a lesson I had to learn was simple things like don't get into email battles with your client late at night because you have no idea if they're on the other end, knocking a few back or what's going on. And it's like, let's just reset tomorrow, that kind of thing. And so knowing how to read people, when to read people, et cetera, it's a big part of, I think, what we do as real estate agents, but certainly what comes into your business every day.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Uh, all right, I want to shift a little bit and talk specifically about when you're in a transaction. Are there any common themes that you've seen over the years, or something that predominantly sticks out that leads to a contract termination more often?
Hmm. No, I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to money and time, right?
Hmm.
So, sometimes the buyer needs more time, and the seller, in a market where there's not a back, there's not a strong indication that there's going to be other interest anytime soon, the seller is generally willing to say, okay, I'll give you some time. Or the buyer asks for a price concession, and the seller says, I think I've gone to as low as I'm going to go, and I don't really have an appetite for this. Or, but in a during the COVID bananas, it was people were crawling all over each other, and sellers they didn't even have to respond. And so, I think I don't know that I can generalize about the specifics of a particular transaction because it's so market driven by what's going on, both inside this particular transaction and in a more macro level in the Aspen market generally, that leads to deals closing or not.
Yeah, so you touched on something that is exactly where I kind of wanted to go with that conversation, which is there may not be a specific, oh, here's what happens a lot, because if that was the case, I think we would all know how can we try to avoid that. So it changes depending on the market environment we're in, and it's like you said during COVID, I think there was just a lot more just get to closing, just taking order kind of thing and go versus a more what I would call traditional or typical market that we saw pre-COVID, and it feels like we're swinging back into or already into right now. What do you think has changed the most from your perspective in your business and or just the real estate market in Aspen over the last 5 or 10 years? Obviously, COVID played a huge part of this, but what does your lens tell you about that?
In terms of the personalities or the market, or I'm not sure what
The,
you're.
oh, sorry, the market itself, but how you interact with it. So clients, whether they come to you and they have different requests or the way that you work with them is different. So for by way of example, as real estate agents, I think what we saw was a shift from what was you're either in a buyer or seller's market. It was kind of balanced more or less before COVID. Prices were going up, steadily. Then you hit COVID, and it was much more about I need this now, and if I'm overpaying, that's fine because there's not another option out there, or I need this as a home. To now, we're starting to see this. I think the dynamic from the agent standpoint shift a little bit more back towards the buyers. Maybe sellers aren't as strong. So what I'm wondering from your perspective is, are you seeing a change in personalities, a change in the type of what they're asking of you in a transaction, or has that stayed relatively steady through all of that real estate market price change and dynamic change from an agent?
Well, I think I concur with your observation, which is, before COVID and currently, I always felt like, the when the Roaring Fork Valley market slows down, it seems like it's an anomaly compared to the country because the it appears that it's you guys, it's the real estate agents who suffer because sellers don't lower their prices typically. There's not a lot of liquidity pressure on sellers. They're not highly leveraged with their loan coming due, and I gotta reduce my price by 25% to get out of this jam. So you've got sellers who are patient, who are saying, look, this is my price, and if it takes an extra year or two to sell, the market sellers believe the market will come back. I got buyers calling me, I can sense the frustration in their voices saying, this doesn't make any sense. Don't these sellers realize that the market is down in LA and in New York, and real estate and interest rates are going up? And if they don't lower their price, they're never going to sell their property. And we got to come in at 20% under asking, and they got to take it. And I say, well, we can try, but we can't make that happen. So it seems like, we're shifting back more towards a more balanced approach where it's not the COVID environment and things are slowing down, but I don't think it's a sign of any distress. It's just a sign that, the buyers are expecting concessions and lower prices, and the sellers are not quite there. And I don't know if, in my experience, the sellers don't often get there ever. They're just like, they'll just wait till they get their price.
Yeah, it's so true. It's such an interesting facet about our market. The number of sellers who want but don't quote unquote need to sell, and what that translates to for that dynamic. Um, I gave you a softball earlier. I'm going to give you a hard pitch now in the spirit of the World Series. It's interesting from an agent standpoint, real estate agent standpoint, what's evolved the last couple of years. There was this big NAR settlement that really changed a little bit of the fundamentals of how agents interact with a buyer earlier in the process and determine what that relationship is. Colorado is one of those states that allows for effectively this transaction broker model, which doesn't exist in other states. As an attorney, are you ever in a position where you could represent both sides? And do you think real estate agents should be able to represent both sides of a transaction? Why not?
I think that's a great question, and it's actually not a hardball. I think that's the easiest question you've asked. So I think it's great that agents can act as transaction brokers because I think, at least in our valley, given where uh, given the prices that we deal with, all up and down the valley, not just in Aspen. Um, Real estate agents, to me, bring tremendous value in the introductions, getting the parties together, which is probably the biggest part of what you guys do. And then it's doing the things that are not really advocacy, because most transactions, or at least the ones I'm involved in, obviously your lawyers are involved in. And so I don't think buyers or sellers need a buyer's agent and a buyer's lawyer, or a seller's agent and a seller's lawyer. But it's massively helpful to the transaction to have a capable real estate agent who understands the issues, who can liaison with the title company. We need the title commitment now, or, can you get us copies of these documents, or can you go check a file somewhere? So I think it's fantastic that we have the ability to, that you guys have the ability to be on both sides of a deal. Sellers can't. I mean, lawyers cannot. So there's sort of, we touched on waivers of conflicts of interest. There's sort of waivable and non-waivable conflicts. And among the non-waivable conflicts in the legal profession are, you can't represent a buyer and the seller in the same transaction. You can't represent a husband and a wife in the same divorce, that sort of thing. So we just can't go there. It doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be smart, but I think it's really helpful in many occasions when you guys can do it. Chad,
Yeah,
Haley,
great.
what do you guys think?
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. I think that the transactional piece, especially like you said, when you've got lawyers on both sides, that's where the advocacy piece comes in. So yeah, I agree, Chris.
Yeah, and I must have said thousands of times in my career to clients, do I need to be worried that, Andrew he was my listing agent, now he's going to be a transaction broker? I say that, don't worry about that at all. That's going to be just fine.
Yeah, I think from an agent's view, it does take a matter of touch and skill from a communication standpoint. It just comes back to that, right? It comes
Right.
back to communicating to everybody what your role is and how you're involved. And to your point, it takes a huge burden off if there's attorneys on each side, on both sides, because that is an advocacy role that's very important.
Well,
And
that was the hard question I was going to put back at you, which is, what do you do when you're a transaction broker? And it's probably not that often, but you don't have a lawyer on either side. I mean,
so this
that's
is
a
my
much.
interview. I don't have to answer questions. So when I was representing clients, I really relished that opportunity because I welcomed the conversation that would happen often where, let's say I was on the listing and I brought a buyer, and my seller would say, well, we have a listing agency agreement. You're my agent. How's this going to work? I'm not comfortable that you'll also be representing the buyer. And aside from this, the simple part of the conversation, which is, well, we don't have to play the telephone game of another agent in between where I'm sending along a message that I don't know if it'll be received in the same way by the time it gets through to the buyer. There's this piece of, we're past the point of me having to be your advocate, especially like I said, if an attorney's involved. And really what I'm here for is to counsel you, give you advice if you would like it, but to make sure that the process is as transparent to you, and it's I always looked at it as it's my fiduciary responsibility to make sure when and after we close the transaction, you as the seller, but also I'm going to have the same conversation with the buyer, that we left nothing on the table, that everything was put out there that was supposed to be put out there. And if there was something material, I have to disclose it. If there's something that for some reason I'm not supposed to disclose the other side, then that relationship doesn't change whether somebody else is involved or not as another agent. So to me, it was always pretty straightforward. Every once in a while, there'd be a client who say, I don't get it. But those are typically people who see no value in a real estate agent anyway.
But how do you handle this one though? I mean, so you've got the listing,
Sure.
and the seller says, the property's on the market for 10 million bucks. And the buyer, you're in due diligence, and the buyer is saying, I need a $500,000 credit. I'll close at 9.5. And if you're a transaction broker and there's no lawyers involved, what do you do when the seller says, Andrew, I'll take the 9.5 because I got to close this, but get them up to 9.8, and you got to be loyal to sort of both sides. I mean, is that one you just have to punt and say you got to get a lawyer, or can you manage that?
No, I think that's the softball to me. That's the easy one where I say to the seller, I say, I will deliver whatever message you would like me to deliver, but I'd like you as a seller to coach me on that message, because I don't want it to be my voice. I don't want it to be me influencing this in a way that's unfair to either side. So if you are saying to me, you'll take 9.5, I didn't want to know that, but I know it. That's fine. I won't disclose it. But I would like to know, what do you want me to say about getting them to 9.8? And let's have a good conversation. I'll give you my input, but ultimately I want that message to come from you. And then when I go to the other side, to be able to say, here I am with the message from the seller. Here's what they would like. Here's why. And what do you think? And then we have a similar back and forth. But for me, I found that relatively easy, just to take myself out of it and really put it back. And I do think there's a little bit of an art to that, to be able to ask the right questions and not use your opinions or
Hmm.
insert your own opinions into the situation. And I do think a lot of times where real estate agents can go a little bit off track is, it's just like a public official. When we vote for a mayor and city council people or county commissioners, a lot of times you'll see them make a decision that you're like, is that really for the constituents or for yourself? And that's a hard thing to separate, right? So I think in this situation that you're painting, to be able to separate from that. All right, so we're just about 30 minutes, which is what I had aimed for the call. I want to end with one topic that I've been thinking about a lot lately for our company, for my business, for our business, and I'm curious your take on it. So certainly AI is a hot topic everywhere in the world right now in all different industries, and I don't want to lead you to answer this only through the lens of just AI, but over the next 5 to 10 years, do you see any significant change in your industry, in your work, the way you interact with agents, with clients, with transactions, either from AI, other technologies, just what's happening in our business?
That's a good question. I actually don't, but I don't. I'm not saying that with any degree of confidence. I mean, I just feel like I've been doing what I've been doing for long enough that I kind of do it in a certain way, and the people so I don't I don't have a 20-year horizon on my career, so I'm not thinking I need to adapt to do something differently in the year 2040. It's not. So, so I feel like, our market is unique enough, our clients are unique enough, the valley is unique enough that I still think it's going to come down to, individuals, on the client side who are trying to get things done, who are going to need to talk to you.
It feels to me like there's this potential out there, and I'm calling it just potential for now, in a different kind of market, in a more, what I'll say, sort of generic or metropolitan market, like Denver or Cincinnati or Los Angeles, where for a real estate transaction, the level of sophistication, automation through AI or just online algorithms or tools. And an example is like Zillow already sort of went
Yeah,
through this huge wave of providing Zestimates or values, which are really accurate in a lot of markets. Not so much in our market because of some of the unique attributes, but it does feel like appraisers, real estate agents, to a degree, attorneys, um, that becomes more flattened in the transactions that are a little more vanilla, like to your example earlier of like a condo transaction.
right.
And so I just wonder if we all, as our unique professions in this environment, survive that in a way because of how special or unique our market is. And I hate talking about it that way, but I think it is. I think it's hard to flatten our market in that way. Is that what you see, or do you see something different?
Haley, you got a longer horizon than me. What do you think?
I was going to say that I think certain aspects, well, first of all, we already have where we see a lot of AI, at least in our practices, is on the transactional side for sure, is clients who come in with a contract that, LegalZoom prepared. And so that has already sort of been in the works. And with Colorado's standard forms, the contract piece is already kind of there too. But because you've got two humans on either side of a transaction that need to make their own decisions, there's always going to be a need for that advocacy piece or that advice piece. So I think that part of the practice will stay and can't necessarily be replaced by AI or other types of technology, which is a good thing. A buyer might be able to run a title commitment through AI someday and have an understanding of what some of these, exceptions might say, but how that interacts with what's happening on the land is a place where a human, a lawyer can actually help. And I think that's going to keep some job security for us too. So I think there's certain parts of the transactions that may change, maybe become more efficient, but I don't think it's going to totally replace the broker's role or the lawyer's role ultimately.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, something we've been talking about loosely in our company and our meetings is AI is there, other technologies have been there, and if you are ignorant to that or not embracing them at the very least, then there will be parts of our jobs that go away, and so you have to find a way to augment that or prove your value. I really appreciate you, Haley, Chad, Chris. Thank you for a great dialogue, incredibly interesting, insightful, and valuable. Chris, I look forward to catching up with you a little bit later,
Yeah, for
and
sure.
I wish you all to have a great day. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and just Andrew, one last thing. Thanks for the opportunity again, and
Yeah.
for everybody on the call, on Andrew's side of this. I mean, don't feel like you need to, have a full-blown transaction. I mean, any of you can call any of us at any time with a, hey, I got a 2-second thing, and we'll let you know if it's, not appropriate or whatever. But part of what we like and enjoy doing is getting to know you all and brainstorming on, you're writing an offer. We don't need to know the names of the parties or run a conflict check. Just say, I'm the listing agent and I'm struggling with this thing or that thing. And, if you want to brainstorm, just, you're not going to get a bill for that kind of stuff. And we're here to help and, enjoy doing it.
That's awesome, Chris. There's a reason why, as I say to our agents, we are provided with a form contract and we have form clauses. Anything outside of that, we should not be doing. You and your colleagues are the people to go to and call on that. So thank you for reinforcing that. Great. Well, have an awesome day. Appreciate everything and carry on.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Andrew. Thanks,
See ya.
everyone.
Thank you.